Good morning and welcome to Inquirer Live, Worldview with Trudy Rubin. I'm Trudy Rubin, the world affairs columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and we're going to be discussing a particularly timely topic, the rise of the new global far right. The January 6th attack on the Capitol focused our minds on the growing threat from far-right radicalism, which the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security now recognize as a preeminent danger to the country. Only yesterday, National Guards were once more protecting the Capitol from a bizarre threat by the QAnon cult. Fortunately, it didn't materialize, but there was lots of traffic with threats on social media. General Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, is now accelerating efforts to root out extremism in the ranks, a long-time problem that has really come to a head now since vets and serving military were amongst the people at the Capitol on January 6th. And only yesterday, as I said, the National Guards were out there, but more pertinent, perhaps, this radicalism has penetrated one of the two major U.S. parties. But as you will hear, the themes and memes of far-right radicalism cross borders, and its adherents communicate with each other. The German experience is particularly pertinent despite the differences in our history and culture. The German Bundestag was attacked by radicals in 2020, and the security services there have also been infiltrated. The German government was intending to put the country's main opposition political party, the far-right Alternative for Deutschland, known as the AfD for short, under surveillance for extremism. But a press leak got in the way. We'll talk more about that later. So we couldn't have two better discussants on the new global far right, two experts who have worked together on what Germany and the United States can learn from each other on this topic. Cynthia Miller-Idriss is an award-winning author and scholar of extremism and radicalization, and is the author of Hate in the Homeland, the new global far right. Dr. Miller-Idriss directs the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab at American University in Washington, D.C. And Daniel Kohler is the director of the German Institute on Radicalization and De-Radicalization Studies in Stuttgart, and the author of Right-Wing Terrorism in the 21st Century, the National Socialist Underground, and the History of Terror from the Far Right. Before we get to the discussion, I just want to go over a few housekeeping details so you will know how to participate in the event. At any time, you can submit questions in the comment section at the bottom of this page. And if you're watching on social media, you can join in for questions for the Q&A by going to inquirer.com/TrudyLive, one word, to submit your question at the bottom of the page in the comments section. And I will try to address as many questions as I can when we get to Q&A at the end of the presentation. So let me start, Cynthia, by asking you, could you give us a brief picture of how you define both the nature and the threat of right-wing radicalism, white supremacist violence, militias in the wake of October 6th? And how has it accelerated in recent years? I know this is a big subject, but just so there's a lot of people who are watching who aren't familiar with the whole spectrum of this. So if you could just give us a brief introduction.
Sure, and thanks, Trudy. It's great to be here, and Daniel, good to see you again. So the far right is, first of all, there's no universal term across borders or even within our own country for how to refer to it. So I often call the far right the best bad term we have available. Even the agencies of the federal government don't use the same terminology to refer to it. That's a problem, obviously, and something that hopefully will resolve these terminology issues. But the far right generally refers to a spectrum of extremism that crosses a number of different groups, including white supremacists and anti-government extremist groups are the largest, but also incel, kind of male supremacist violence, some single actor extremist groups focused on abortion, for example. They share in common a sense of threat, typically, that is captured in some combination of four elements, usually anti-democratic or anti-authoritarian kinds of beliefs, authoritarian, anti-democratic types of beliefs that include things like failure to protect minority rights or the rule of law or freedom of the press. Usually some sort of hierarchical sets of beliefs about superiority and inferiority. So that can be by race, white supremacy, by religion, often Christian supremacy. We have male supremacy. You've heard the term probably Western chauvinists, which is the the description the Proud Boys use. So there can be Western kind of supremacy that just positions groups of people as a superior or inferior. And then the remaining two categories have to do with conspiracy theories and kind of fantasies about a restoration or some better future that will come after often an apocalyptic end times. And finally, the use of violence, and not just often the justified use of violence, but the desired use of violence to bring about chaos and societal collapse. Not all far-right groups share all of those elements, but you typically see some combination. And what we have seen, both globally and in the US, are increases on essentially every measure that we have available, both in terms of the lethality, the amount of propaganda circulating, the numbers of plots foiled by, by law enforcement. And that's led to a number of hearings before Congress. And then finally, in October of 2020, to the Department of Homeland Security declaring domestic violent extremism in general and white supremacist extremism in particular the greatest threat facing the nation. The most persistent and lethal threat was their language. And it's also up 250% globally. So I'm sure Daniel will talk about that. But it's there's no question that we're at a moment when there's no question anymore. There was some question for some time, a lot of attention to Islamist and international terrorism after 9/11. But I think in the wake of 2018, 2019, and finally into 2020 now, it's very clear. And so the questions have obviously turned to what do we do about it?
Now, just to clarify one thing, would you say that it's correct that right now, summarizing what you've said, white supremacist violence and anti-government violence, including from militias, is where the greatest threat is? And, you know, many people are confused. They tend to conflate Antifa, this movement, loose movement on the left, not an organization. And certainly many Americans say, well, what about violence on the left? But to clarify, I mean, the FBI and Homeland Security are saying right now that the major threat is not there. The threat is far-right radicalism, white supremacist violence.
That's right. So for those of the audience who are around in the 1970s and early 1980s, there was a time when political violence was dominated by the left, and those statistics are clear, both in the US and globally. But that changed in the early to mid 1980s, and then we saw the rise of far-right extremism on the anti-government side and the white supremacist side, eventually culminating in Oklahoma City, the death of 168 people. And then what happened after that is that essentially we were distracted by the very real threat of Islamist and international terrorism, but kind of took our eyes off the ball as a country of the continuing threat that was increasing, particularly after President Obama was elected. And then we saw an astronomical number, record-breaking number of hate groups, along with new kinds of anti-government militias forming. at that time, and they just continued to grow. And then there was a kind of normalization and mainstreaming that we saw as evidenced in Charlottesville, Virginia, and that rally, which most people will remember, followed by several terrorist incidents of violence in Christchurch and El Paso and Pittsburgh. And so there's now no question in the statistics. I think there's still a lot of misinformation circulating about Antifa and what that is. And Daniel, of course, as a German expert, will tell you there's a long history there as well of anti-fascist violence that does rise. We have seen rising numbers of far left violence over the last couple of years as well, because it often rises in reaction to rising far right violence. So that is an expected outcome of rising far right violence. But we also have, of course, there's still environmental terrorism, there's animal liberation terrorism, and anarchist concerns. So it's not that there's no violence from the left, but the statistics are very clear on where the threat landscape lies.
And I just want to ask you one more thing before turning to Daniel. The issue of mainstreaming. This seems to be one of the big changes in recent years, especially under the previous political administration. Talk about that a bit, because things that used to be considered sort of radical and unacceptable somehow seem to have moved into public discourse, or even in some obvious occasions, including recently on January 6th, into the Republican Party.
Well, what we've seen happen sort of over the last 5 to 7 years, I would say, is a mainstreaming and normalization on 3 different levels. And that's one of the reasons why it's been so effective. We have had a mainstreaming in political rhetoric, where you have anti-immigration sentiment, again, not just in the US, but globally through populist, nationalist kinds of rhetoric, a lot of anti-immigration, anti-Islam, anti-Semitic rhetoric coming across, and racist language coming across much more frequently from political leaders and in mainstream political platforms of elected parties in Europe, for example, which I'm sure Daniel will talk about. But we've also had then a mainstreaming of the aesthetics, which is really what I've been studying for years. And that's why when you saw in Charlottesville these young men in khakis and polo shirts walking across a campus carrying tiki torches, it didn't match the kind of picture that a lot of Americans hold in their heads about what white supremacists look like, with a swastika tattoo or a shaved head and bomber jacket and combat boots. And that's really changed. And I think that the kind of youth culture and the way that youth culture is evolved has been weaponized effectively by the far right in many ways that we have yet to fully kind of acknowledge and understand, even though there's been a lot of increased work on that. And finally, we've seen a mainstreaming of conspiracy theories themselves. And that, of course, was really evident on January 6th and has been exceptionally clear with the growth of QAnon over the past 10 months or so, especially during the pandemic. And that's really different, where you really have mainstream politicians and media and individuals in regular walks of life fully believing in conspiracy theories and misinformation about a cabal of elites running a pedophile ring or about a stolen election. And so that all 3 fronts have happened at once, and that's part of why the mainstreaming has been so effective.
So just to elaborate a bit, to have these young men in Charlottesville carrying torches and screaming, "Jews will not replace us," isn't what you would expect from looking at young people of that type, right? And that kind of language is out there. And then to have people who look perfectly normal adopting the QAnon conspiracy madness, that there's a cabal of Democrats and government officials who want to kill children and use their blood in basements, something that seems mad. And yet there are people in Congress who embrace it. So this is mainstreaming, right?
Right. I mean, I think it's easier for people. I mean, and I empathize with this. It's for people to want to other, people who hold extremist beliefs, to think that that's something that could be separated from society, like a tumor. Kind of really cut out and monitored and surveilled and then arrested and prosecuted. But really, we have seen it over the past few years work much more like a contagion, like a contagious virus, in which people get infected, and they're more vulnerable to it for lots of different reasons. Why some people are vulnerable and not others, but it's not just kind of the typical. It's not just somebody in an Aryan Brotherhood prison gang who's affected. It's sometimes the person next door, and I think that was really striking in the Charlottesville. People didn't have masks over their head. They didn't have Ku Klux Klan hoods. They were showing their faces, and that we saw that on January 6th too. People had their feet up on desks, snapping selfies and sharing them on social media, quite proud of their actions, and that's a different kind of mainstreaming.
So Daniel, let me ask you the same questions. There's an acceleration of far-right radicalism in Germany also, right? Not a new problem. And also elsewhere in Europe. But let's talk about Germany. How would you describe the situation there? And has it gone mainstream as well, even in a country that has worked so hard to prevent a resurgence of right-wing radicalism given its history?
Thank you, Trudy, first of all, for having me today. It's a huge pleasure and honor to be here and join this panel with Cynthia, who I greatly admire for her groundbreaking work in this field. So I really enjoy talking to you today about this. When it comes to the far right in Germany, I have to say that there have always been waves, ups and downs of extremist, rightist, violent activity, for example. But we've always, essentially in every decade after the end of the Second World War, we saw certain phases of increased far right or extremist violent activities and crimes, terrorist attacks, for example. We've always had a long tradition of neo-Nazis, white supremacists actually trying to attack the government, kill people in every decade, more or less. And in the last couple of years in Germany, the number of so-called violent extreme right-wingers, which are estimated annually by our federal intelligence services, has steadily increased to roughly about 15 to 20,000 individuals, more or less. It's a rough estimate. And since what has been dubbed the so-called refugee crisis 2014-15 happened in Europe, where large numbers of refuge-seeking persons from Iraq, Syria, and other countries came to Europe, this has resulted in a major uptick of far-right violence in Germany. As the movement reacts to that, they try to recruit, they try to mobilize, they try to bring people into a state of emotional hatred and existential threat. Not unlike in the US, when there was talk about an invasion of immigrants coming from the South to stir up these kind of negative emotions and the feeling of being under threat, being under attack. This is something that the far right strategically uses to mobilize its own supporters, its own networks. And this is what happened in Germany as well. And we still see the effects of that. So the numbers of far-right violence obviously have, and the numbers of activists have steadily increased over the last years. And then there were a number of high impact terrorist attacks. For example, the assassination of a high-ranking German politician in 2019 by a neo-Nazi. Obviously, the attempted mass shooting attack on a synagogue in Halle in 2020, and then the shooting attack in Hanau in front of a shisha cafe. So these are just three incidents that happened recently here that highly shocked the society and the German country, the nation, and again signified the persistent threat that comes from this environment, which is also always changing and developing and adapting to new situation. It's as Cynthia said, it's not the classical skinhead, shaven hat, combat boots type of individual or a milieu that is always responsible for these kind of attacks. These are new forms of radicalization, new forms of mobilization, new subcultural forms that have come up in the last couple of years. And statistically, the effects of that are significant. In Germany, we see every day 2 to 3 violent extreme right-wing hate crimes being committed every single day. So someone is attacked and hurt by people with extreme right-wing views or associations. So clearly the threat is a dominant and a major one in Germany as well.
Now, in Germany, because of your history, the government has taken on more powers to go after right-wing extremism, correct? And you actually have a system where the government can label people as radical and surveil them, even if they haven't committed a crime. There's a line between being anti-constitution or being simply risky. And that allows you to collect data on how much radicalization there is. Could you very briefly explain? That seems very strange to American ears, but it gives you data to examine the problem more thoroughly.
It actually gives us even more than just data to get a grasp on the scope of the problem. The background here is that Germans have actually made a very, very hurtful and lasting experience, which is losing our own democracy. After the end of the First World War, the first German democratic republic was established, the Weimar Republic, until it was actually dismantled and taken away by the Nazis in 1933. And this experience of how an extremist political party or a movement can grow using these political freedoms they have in a democracy with the essential goal to abolish democracy and take it away, that is something that the Germans have taken as a major lesson after the end of the Second World War. And one of these lessons is that there is something happening before hard, violent crimes are being committed, which is what we today would call a radicalization process or a mobilization process fueled by ideas and a philosophy or worldviews which are in essence toxic or poisonous to the core fundamental values of a democratic society. For example, equality, universal dignity of human life, the rule of law, for example, or equal participation in our political societies through elections or through the freedom of forming associations and parties or free press, for example. So the Germans have formed a legal concept of extremism framed by the courts as holding active combative views against the core tenets of the German democratic society. For example, as I said, rule of law, democratic principle, and the universal dignity of human life. So people who associate themselves and try to destroy these things on the long run, they can be surveilled, they can be monitored, they can be labeled as extremists by our intelligence services, which allows them to act a little bit like a smoke detector. They see where these extremist milieus are forming, how radical they become, how dangerous they become, to alert the politicians, to alert society, actually to raise awareness and eventually even alert the police about potential terrorist threats. Now, this is the German system, which is basically the result of our first failed democracy.
Are people told that they're under surveillance?
Yes and no. Obviously, as intelligence services have to operate in some kind of secrecy that comes with a job, they are not always individually told that they're monitored. But the German intelligence services on the federal and state level, they publish annual reports where they actually brief the public about their activities, about certain groups and parties they consider to be extremists, sometimes even individuals, certain events, trends, developments that they see as important. and thereby fulfilling their legal obligation to inform the public about their threat assessment when it comes to any form of extremist threats, not just the far right, anyone that is a danger to the German democratic society and core values.
So, in other words, you have thousands of people who are labeled extremists but haven't broken any laws. If they actually break the law, they're in a different category and they can be pursued and charged. But you sort of have a prequel. Cynthia, is that a concept that in our First Amendment society could ever be emulated? I mean, I know you have written about the usefulness of knowing and having insight into people who are on their way and might be about to violate the law. In Germany, they've set up a system for that, which to Americans seems almost impossible, surveilling people before they've broken the law. And just to add to that, as I mentioned before, the largest opposition party in the Bundestag, although it has, 12%, Daniel? Or
yeah,
10?
about that. Yeah,
about that. But still, the intelligence community had wanted to surveil that. And for reasons that may be too complicated to discuss here, when the press leaked it, they had to postpone that. But it seemed, could we ever have surveillance in advance of militia groups or elements of the Republican Party if they were consorting with militias or QAnon? Does it have relevance here?
I think that in the United States context, it would never catch on or work. I can't imagine unless what happened in Germany was a tragedy. The Holocaust, the Nazi regime, the Holocaust, that has led to a really different political culture and social culture, even, and a relationship to the government and to the understanding, I think, of the fragility of democracy and the ways in which individuals can be manipulated at scale that we just don't have. I think we are waking up to the idea that we might not be, that we are a more fragile democracy than we thought, and that millions of people are susceptible to disinformation and misinformation and propaganda. But I think we'll have to find solutions in this country that do, work within our First Amendment protections, which are much stronger on free speech than really almost any other country. So it's not just Germany, but most of Europe has stricter rules about what can be said and not, and has more restrictions on free speech than we do. So I think that is a very cherished right and freedom in the States, and we'll have to find solutions that do work within it, which is another reason why, and I'm sure I'll get to this, I think we have to really be thinking about early prevention within the mainstream in terms of media literacy, rather than waiting until we're already dealing with a significantly early radicalized or at-risk population, because there isn't much we can do then with that population until they actually do something illegal. And it's very difficult to de-radicalize, although Daniel's really the expert on this. It's very difficult to initiate de-radicalization at scale once people are already committed. It's much easier to try to prevent them from entering those pathways to begin with.
I'm going to get to that in a moment, because I do want to discuss, for example, civic education in Germany, and also other possible prevention mechanisms that both of you have written about. But let me ask first about infiltration of the military. In the USA, there's been a long problem of racism in the military, and we see also the problem in the police. That is happening in Germany too, and apparently has come to a head that has forced the German security services to face it. Are there things to be learned here from each other? Daniel, talk just briefly about the situation in Germany. And then, Cynthia, maybe you can talk about whether there's relevant lessons for here. First, Daniel.
Well, we have a long string of individual stories or publicly known cases of officers, military officers, soldiers being involved in right-wing terrorism plots. So that goes a long way. You have to know that Germany, up until quite recently, had a conscription-based mandatory service military, which would mean that also people with extreme right-wing views would automatically enter the service. Germans have a military intelligence that operates roughly under the same guidance. Their sole purpose, or one of the key goals they have, is to identify and screen out individuals who hold extremist attitudes and or commit extremist behavior and remove them from active service. That in itself is a major advantage, that we have an inter-military intelligence organization tasked with identifying extremists and removing them as quickly as they can. So they do it all day long. They screen soldiers, they screen military personnel for potential extremism, and if they identify them, they remove them. That's a good, important advantage. They have recently begun to publish annual reports as well to inform the public about case numbers, statistics, and their developments. But the cases that have come to light are concerning, to say the least. To name just a few, German lieutenant, active duty lieutenant, was involved just a couple of years ago. He was detected and is currently charged. The trial will begin soon with plotting a false flag terrorist attack. He allegedly tried to frame Syrian refugees for plotting a shooting attack. In another case, our special forces, the KSK, which is the top elite special forces unit in the German military, has an officer of that unit wrote a public letter basically asking for help, saying that this organization is infiltrated by far-right extremists and there's nothing being done about it, which obviously caused a huge public outcry. In the end, a whole combat platoon of battle-hardened special forces soldiers had to be completely disbanded because the military found it's not possible to essentially rework the situation, and they wanted to start from scratch. So that means that there's a lot of developments, a lot of problems going on. And as Cynthia said, I cannot overstress that information is the key here to identify and conduct the most adequate strategy. If you don't know what you're up against, if you don't know what you're facing, there's no way to find the right pathway ahead. And the Germans have realized that we don't even know the scale of extremist attitudes in our military. So the German government has officially charged the Ministry of Defense to conduct a comprehensive study on the political attitudes of military personnel as a first step.
Sorry, I don't mean to stop you, but I want to get in one more thing before questions. So the point is, Lloyd Austin, what a task, has to figure out some way to get the information and screen the recruits. But let me just, before questions, come to this very important part, which is, Cynthia, you've written that the U.S. approach to dealing with radicalization is too security focused. So if you could just speak briefly about how you think the focus could change. And then, Daniel, I want to talk to you about Germany's Civic Education program.
Well, sure. We as a country have been addressing terrorism and extremism, domestic violent extremism, essentially through a very law enforcement and securitized approach. And I live in Washington, D.C., so anyone who lives in Washington, D.C. is now quite familiar with the repercussions of that, and essentially what became a militarized city with checkpoints on the bridges and impossible to access parts of downtown. Right after the 6th through the inauguration and continued, yesterday again with high threat level, inaccessible parts of the mall or downtown near the Capitol. And so, I think the question is why can't we conceive of an alternative to that future, which would require kind of much earlier investments in education. And so, one of the things I often say is, after 9/11, we got an entire new agency, the Department of Homeland Security, which is focused on risk. I mean, that was one of the things that came out of 9/11. And I think we need that scale of response here to think about combating misinformation and interventions. It doesn't have to be a new agency, but that's the level of investment and cooperation across agencies. But instead of relying really only on the expertise of folks who are trained in terrorism and security studies and law enforcement, bringing in larger numbers of people who are teachers, who are experts in education and social work, and who work with young people in particular who we know are vulnerable, but also in this case, as we saw on January 6th, we have adults who have fully radicalized into a universe of disinformation. So we need it across the spectrum. And, I know Daniel will comment on this, but one of the reasons, one of the long-term things I think we also need is real lessons from other countries, because we don't have to just reinvent the wheel and come up with our own solutions, even as we think about needing to do what's culturally and politically appropriate here in terms of First Amendment rights. There are a lot of things we can learn from other places that have been doing this much longer. And I think we are really a generation behind, or a generation and a half or more behind, the efforts that countries in Germany and Norway and other places, New Zealand as well, have been making on the prevention side.
So Daniel, on the prevention side, one thing that I think is so interesting is the civic education programs in Germany, which are required throughout every school, correct? So could you just briefly, because I do want to get in some questions, but this is so important, talk about how civic education works, the debates, the framing of the courses?
Mm-hmm. This is absolutely one of the most important issues, because one might get the impression that Germans are all about surveillance, intelligence, and then the threat will go away. It's exactly the opposite. It's also very contested here. It just adds to the portfolio of different measures and tools that you have available. And prevention, education, mental health, community support, family support are all components of that network of potential measures. And civic education, or what we call political education here in Germany, is obviously very established in our primary and secondary school education, including education about the history of the Shoah, National Socialism, the reign of the Nazis, everything, the Second and First World War. It's ingrained in our educational system. When I went to school, I had to visit mandatorily. I had to visit several concentration camp memorial sites. It was deeply ingrained in our educational process. Civic education, or political education, is really about learning how your country works, the tradition, the history, but also fundamental democratic values, even to a detail like how is a law made? How do elections work? Why is democracy today the way it is? And how did it evolve? How did it develop? And then there is obviously the German Constitution, which gives every German citizen a fundamental right to education, including that kind of education which is seen as fundamental to make a decision, a political decision about who to vote for and how to participate in our society. So the government has to make sure that every German citizen has equal opportunity to access that information, which is crucial to make informed decision about how you want to live in a German society. And so on a federal and state level, there are governmentally funded so-called centers of civic education, which provide material for teachers, which host workshops, which provide cheap books on history and politics and racism and elections and everything that you need to know about how the world, how democracy works today. And they are funded by the government, but they're attached to the parliaments on the state and federal level, and they're more or less independent in choosing their topics. They have academic expert advisory groups who regularly assess the annual curriculum, the offers, the services, and they are more or less really embedded in the communities and offer general education about how politics work, how philosophy works, how culture works, to foster everyone's understanding how to live together in a community.
That's so interesting. And of course, the question is, you have a neutral body that works on the content. You can imagine the fights over that here, but the concept is so important, and the use of non-governmental organizations. I could talk for a whole hour on this, but I'm going to move to questions because we have some interesting ones. One question is this: we've always had hate groups. What's different today is that one of our two main political parties, US, is a party to conspiracy theories and the 1/6 insurrection. How does a democratic country fix the hate problem when one party is part of the problem? And I'm going to put this to Cynthia, but I think, Daniel, also I want to ask you, because the AfD, it's the same situation in Germany, even though they're not in the government now, but they could be in the future, and they're in parliament. So Cynthia, first, what do we do if there is a party in which there are people who are openly mouthing QAnon slogans, encouraging people to march on and take the Capitol, etc.?
Yeah, it's an extremely difficult situation for us and for countries around the world that have far-right political parties that are then democratically elected into parliament, as I know has been happening in Germany and elsewhere. And so we can, hear from Daniel on that as well. For me, what it reinforces is of course, we have an importance of political rhetoric. We know that elected officials' rhetoric really matters and has helped to mainstream and legitimize and normalize a lot of these kinds of conspiracy theories and extremist ideas. But it also tells me that we have to really lean heavily into a civil society approach and focus heavily on the equipping of the public with better strategies to recognize misinformation wherever it comes from, even if it comes from people who you trust as the sources of your information, including elected officials or the media. Having a skepticism about those sources, the source integrity. How do you fact check? How do you go into where can you find sources to do it? And I think we are really, we have equipped young people, for example, with we missed for a generation, but we're much better now at helping them understand how to protect their digital footprints and what privacy looks like online and how to recognize a predator. But we really are still nowhere near doing the job we need to do with the entire public on recognizing propaganda and misinformation wherever the source is. And so to me, again, it just says there's a lot to do on the civil society side, even if we can't rely on the government to do it for us.
And Daniel, so you in Germany and in other European countries, you have radical parties in the parliament. So how the Republican Party has radicals within it. It's a question of what it will become as we go forward. And maybe it will be a radical party in a dangerous sense. We don't know, but it's mixed now. In Germany, the AfD has very radical views. What do you do?
Well, I would double down on what Cynthia said. It's about education, because these parties essentially are, at least for now, they are voted into parliaments by people. And these politicians essentially react to what they think, A, they can get away with, or B, what their voters want them to say or do. So when they think that their own voters want to have a more radical standpoint or espouse certain conspiracy theories, or they think that they don't get punished for it by the electorate, they will do it. For them, it's a power game. And I think that the German situation is much more differentiated. We have a multi-party system. So on a federal and state level, constantly parties need to negotiate consensus to join, for example, a electorate phase of government. We have regularly conservative and liberal parties joining forces, or other constellations of political ideas and philosophies joining forces for a certain term. And we know that parties can split up, There can be radical wings splitting up, forming a new party, more liberal wings splitting up, forming another party. So it's a much more differentiated, diverse system. In the two-party system that I observe in the United States, it's much more confrontational. It's black or white. Either you're with the one side or you're with the other. And if one side radicalizes to a certain point, the voter is essentially left with the decision, do I still stick with that party, or do I cross the line and go to the complete opposite camp? Psychologically, this is a much more difficult decision to make, especially when you have been voting Republican for your whole life and have been growing up in that environment and been socialized in that environment as well. And the Germans, I think, realized that the AfD has been radicalizing as an organization, as a party, and we might even head for eventually the party getting banned or parts of it splitting up and forming a new party, which might be more moderate. So it's a much more diverse and differentiated process here.
We've had a lot of questions that circle around what we're discussing now. And one of them is, given the mainstreaming of conspiracy theory in national and global dialogue, how do we in the U.S. counter this threat while keeping to the First Amendment? And, just to expand that a little, how do we do civic education when we are so divided on views and when the Republican Party endorses or panders to, the questioner asks, some of the extremist views, as we saw at the Capitol, that you're trying to educate against?
Well, these are great questions. I mean, I think, the first thing to know about combating conspiracy theories is it's extremely difficult to do. And so, it goes back to the kind of need to prevent people from believing them in the first place. The reason why it's so hard to do it is because what research shows is that when you're dealing with conspiracy theories, not just other kinds of ideological extremism, but conspiracy theories themselves, when people really believe them, you can't provide factual evidence to counter it. It doesn't work. It actually even sometimes makes it worse and backfires and embeds, reinforces those conspiracy theories in the kind of receptive minds of people who hold them. And so, we can't approach it with the same kinds of strategies we maybe have tried to combat extremism with in the past. And of course, there are even questions about the effectiveness of those strategies. So the first thing I will say is, and this is a bit of a self-serving comment because I run a research lab that's testing interventions, but I really think we lack evidence in the field about what's effective. We lack evidence about what isn't effective and transparency about what works and doesn't work to combat extremism in general, but conspiracy theories in particular, as well as misinformation and disinformation. And so the first thing we really need are investments in that level of research that can quickly be accountable to the public, produce the evidence, and help guide the policy decisions in ways that do in this country protect First Amendment rights. And I think, rather than surveillance, I'd like to see more investment in the early intervention and prevention side of things. I forget the second half of it, but I'm going to stop anyway in case Daniel wants to jump in, so that I know we have not that much time left.
Right. I mean, I think what people are also asking effectively is, if, for example, you want civic education, yet school district by school district, right, yeah. If it's Republican controlled, it would be very hard to get the acceptance of an independent body's presentation of a civic education curriculum, like Daniel describes.
I think
it's partisan. It becomes partisan affected.
Yeah, we're in an extremely polarized environment, and there's no question that content is going to be difficult. And I think it's, again, one of the reasons why I think when I'm talking about media literacy needs, I think that we can talk, I think there is a possibility of coming together around shared interests in combating misinformation, around reducing scapegoating, for example. But it's going to take a kind of bipartisan work to get that kind of curriculum together. And, and we don't even have there's not going to be a national curriculum for it in any case. These are very localized school districts. So we don't even have enough resources out there to offer to school districts at the moment. I think testing resources, showing what's effective, working in kind of finding people across the aisle who are interested in combating misinformation, disinformation, and then can try to kind of get it out there and make it available to the public. One of the things that we found in my lab, we produced a series of toolkits and are in the middle of producing a series of guides rather for parents and caregivers and teachers and practitioners with the Southern Poverty Law Center. And we've had thousands of teachers and parents showing up for webinars. I mean, people are really hungry for this information and for tools and strategies on what to do. They're very, I would even say, desperate in some cases, especially teachers and parents who are facing this in online contexts and don't know. I had a child in my classroom, let's say, who was displaying a symbol that was an extremist group. What are my rights? What can I do? Do I say something or not? It's that child's home environment because it's a Zoom, kind of webinar type class. So people are very hungry for tools and resources, and that's happening across the spectrum. And it's not just a kind of liberal versus conservative thing. But I do agree we have to get past that polarization in order for it to work.
Let me just follow that up by a question. Is American extremism harder to root out because so much violence was historically accepted to control people of color and immigrants?
Well, I think, that's a really important question. And I think that, one of the things we forget, that is sometimes overlooked, let's say, in discussions about white supremacist extremism is that it's based on a foundation of white supremacy. So we do have a legacy of colonialism and, Native American genocide and slavery and things that Jim Crow laws, things that built up over the years. That have then fed the KKK and extremist groups that came about with white supremacists on the extremist fringe using vigilante violence and extremist violence against people of color and ethnic and racial minorities in this country. So there is a long legacy there, but I don't think that means it's intractable. I think that it means that you can't approach the combating of it without also addressing the roots of racism. And again, it's one of the reasons why I really appreciate what Germany's just done. They just passed these 89 measures to combat racism and right-wing extremism. So they see it as an integrated effort. You have to increase, combating of discrimination and raising equity issues with the combating of right-wing extremism. You can't just have these things be completely separate. And I think it's one of the mistakes we are continuing to make in this country is treat those as separate issues when in fact they are very deeply intertwined.
Well, Daniel, let me summarize a couple of questions that have come for you. Firstly, the 89 measures was mentioned by Cynthia. So if you could just, briefly just talk a little bit about the social measures, because in Germany, non-governmental organizations play such a big role in combating racism and radicalism. And then there are a couple of other questions. I mean, one of them being why is the AFD growing so much? What's behind it? And also, how serious is the penetration of the armed forces and police? So that's a big chunk, but I will throw it at you. And if you can be concise, I think we can get to all of them.
The 89 measures are really an emergency plan against racism and far-right extremism, but also for democratic culture and tolerance after the series of far-right attacks. And the social aspects, the non-governmental aspects in it are fitting in a long tradition in Germany, which recognizes that, as you have discussed, civic education can be highly polarized, can be highly debatable and conflictuous. And the Germans have created some kind of a codex or a code for how civic education should be done. For example, that controversial themes should be presented as controversial. There should be no enforced conversion or persuasion of students and kids when it comes to political issues. So these kind of measures kind of protect civic education from political overreach and overstep, because everyone has agreed, okay, let's face it, we need to teach our kids about controversial political issues so that they can make their own opinions and formulate their own views. And these NGOs in Germany are really a vibrant field and essential part of fighting extremism and early prevention. They are funded in all kinds of activities: early prevention, education, supporting teachers, developing new toolkits like what Cynthia said, handbooks, games even. It's hard to describe how wide this field in Germany is. For decades, these NGOs have worked on various issues and provided help and guidelines for professionals of all kinds, and even working with kids in schools with workshops and what you can imagine, really. Right now, a couple of NGOs are developing apps and computer games to teach kids about the threat of radicalization and extremism. And I think partially this is also something to do with the rise of the AfD. And I got to say that the party has not really been able to capitalize as much on the COVID crisis as many feared. It seems that the basic trust in mainstream politics, mainstream government, science, and in most part into the press was not that shattered by the AfD yet. Of course, we saw a lot of damage being done to the government, to the society, through populist or conspirational narratives by that party. But I think it depends on where you are, which state you look at, and then the long political traditions of individuals there regarding general mistrust in government, general mistrust in press, for example, or research. And I think the United States needs something like a CDC just for fighting extremism. And it's not that there's not a science around it. There is, for example, political science, for example, psychology, for example, educational science. We have the experts available, and they can do a neutral job to educate the society about what should be done, what can be done, and offering their services, like in other fields as well. The armed forces really is a head scratcher, because we don't really know the extent of the problem yet. Those cases that we've seen are highly concerning, and obviously highly trained, capable police officers or military personnel holding extremist views are frightening, terrifying to say the least. But I have seen in the 89 measures, for example, a core component is get a grip on how big is the problem. Study and give us data on extremist attitudes in the military. And that's a clear task. The Ministry of Defense has to do it, has to deliver it. The military intelligence has been significantly strengthened. There is much more collaboration going on between governmental, non-governmental agencies in all areas. So I think Germany has tried to massively steer around and get on the right path here.
Thanks. That's great. And for anyone who doesn't know what an NGO is, when we were discussing it, it's non-governmental organization. Just one last quick question, which I think is important. We stepped up security for March 4th because of chatter on right-wing networks, but nothing happened. Did we overreact? And I'll just ask you both briefly, how do we prevent overreaction when there is so much going on in social media that we could have in this country the National Guard out every day? Cynthia.
Well, I would just say I think it's very hard to know if it was an overreaction or if the security measures effectively deterred people from taking action they might otherwise have taken. I think it's always difficult to measure an absence of something. And so, I would love to see less securitization and militarization of the city I live in and of other state capitals and whatever other sites become threats. But I think while those threats are out there, we saw the repercussions of what happens when intelligence reports are not taken seriously by the Capitol Police or other law enforcement on January 6th. And so I think we don't want that either, unfortunately. So I would like to see a de-escalation of the entire thing. But in the meantime, I think we have to live with the threats and the reactions to it.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to end it there. This was fascinating. I thank both of you so much. I think we could have gone on for much longer, and there are more questions, which I'm sorry we couldn't get to. So I want to thank the audience for joining in on Inquirer Live, Worldview with Trudy Rubin. I will be having my next web event in mid-April, and you will be hearing who my guest or guests will be. But in the meantime, thanks for being here on an important but painful subject. And thanks to both of you, Cynthia and Daniel, for taking the time. Bye for now.
Thank you, Trudy. Thanks.
Thanks, Trudy.